Welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. I'm your host, Josh Herring. Today, my guest is Ivana Greco. Ivana practiced as an attorney specializing in qualified retirement plan advising and healthcare litigation until 2021. During the COVID-19 pandemic, she became a stay-at-home mother. In recent years, she's begun researching and writing on family policy. She's published papers with National Affairs and the American Compass, and she's working on a book coming out on the American homemaker. She is also the Wollstonecraft Fellow at the Abigail Adams Institute. Ivana, welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here.
I'm so excited that you responded to a random inquiry over Twitter. I am just so appreciative of folks who are willing to entertain requests for late night conversations about interesting ideas.
I'm delighted.
Before we get to family policy and your research and all of that, tell us a little bit about your journey. How did you get into practicing law, and why did you leave?
So let's see. I went to college at Johns Hopkins, and then I went to law school after that. And I clerked for a couple of years. I worked for a judge in New Jersey, and then another judge in New Jersey. And then I practiced law for a decade. And my primary focus was on litigation, often healthcare litigation. We had a bunch of hospitals as clients, but I also worked frequently on retirement plan advising and advising employers on their benefits that they give to employees. So highly technical. Not all people are interested in this area of law, but it does have very good job security. And I really enjoyed doing it, and I enjoyed working directly with clients.
Well, it sounds like you had sort of the. I mean, that sounds like a dream job in a lot of ways. I mean, I have plenty of friends who have aspired to something of that nature, where they want to get into law, they want to be in sort of a niche field, and yet you made a move out of that. Tell us a little bit about that move out of practicing law.
So yes, I really enjoyed my job. I really liked my clients. All of that was good, but I really missed my kids. Law is a demanding profession. It requires a lot of you, and even before the COVID pandemic, like many people, I was having a really hard time balancing my obligations to my clients and my obligations to my kids.
Mm.
But during COVID, we just could not make it work anymore. The schools around here were shut down for a long time. So I was trying to practice law with little kids around and, attending court hearings and being on client calls and having tantruming toddlers. And at some point in 2021, I just sort of threw in the towel and said, I'm not doing a good job by my family or my clients at the moment, and decided to become a stay-at-home mom.
Excellent. I think that's just a fascinating. I'm always fascinated by the journeys people make in terms of their jobs. I remember my brother several years back was thinking about a career in law, and he had an interview with a lawyer at my dad's church, and he asked the lawyer, like, "Are you happy in your work?" And the lawyer got this look on his face, and he was like, "Yes, I enjoy the work, but," and he went into all this other stuff about just how time consuming the legal profession really was. And that just stuck with me over the years, because it seems like there's so many things that are admirable about a legal career, and yet there's a cost to that as well. Like it's really easy to get focused on, oh wow, you can finish law school and make a huge salary once you kind of get through your first couple of years, but there's a cost to that. And I just find that very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, law and parenting have a lot in similar. Your clients need you when they need you, and that's not always during normal business hours. And your kids need you when they need you, and that doesn't always correspond to exactly the workday either. And so those things can be hard to reconcile.
Well, it sounds like your move in career and life is paralleling your research and your current book project. Tell us a little bit about the book that you're working on.
So I am working on a book about American homemakers, and it has two parts. So the first part discusses the central role that homemakers played in American history. if you look at it right from the founding all the way up to the present day, homemakers have played a really pivotal role in American civic life. So just to give one example, during the Revolutionary War, homemakers were really pivotal in their support of the Continental Army. They were spinning wool to make uniforms. They were fundraising. They were really integral to the success of the Continental Army. And we see this all through American history, that when there's some sort of problem or crisis,
Mm.
it is groups of homemakers who come together to help address it. Um, so I'm writing about that, but also how in the present day we've sort of forgotten that or dismissed that, and sort of understand that the have this conception that the only contribution a woman can make to the general society is by entering in the workforce. And I think that's really short-sighted. So my book tries to both explore that and present some policy solutions to make it easier for moms and dads who want to become stay-at-home parents.
Oh man, that's really exciting. I think of that reminds me of two things. I remember one of my favorite scenes in Jimmy Stewart's movie "It's a Wonderful Life" is in uh, George Bailey is off selling war bonds, but Mary Bailey is simultaneously patching up the house, taking care of the kids on a daily basis, and I think she's also working as a nurse, and she's doing like all these other things, but she's doing exactly what you're describing, and I have trouble imagining that happening today, just because it would pull people they've accepted all these other obligations. I love your focus on not just sort of the stereotypical women have to be the homemakers. I have a good friend who has a PhD in classics, and his wife is a practicing physician, and they just had their first baby, and he made the most sense for their family for him to stay home and take care of their son. And so they just kind of have this inverted stereotype, and it works really well for them, and they're both very happy in it. And it kind of pressed me a little bit, thinking, oh well, I had this sort of stereotypical vision of how this ought to work, but here's a picture of that working in a very different way, but it works really, really well. I think it seems like the key is one parent who's home, kind of focusing on the needs of the home and the children, and one parent who's kind of focusing on the economic side of family life.
Yeah, I mean, families sort of make this work all sorts of ways. And I certainly am not looking down in any way on families that have two working parents. I've been there myself. I get it. And for lots of families, both parents need to work. But I totally agree. One of the great things about the 21st century is it's not only mom who can stay home. Sometimes for some families, it works better if it's dad. And so I am hoping for policymakers to be flexible in recognizing that.
Well, let's get to some of those policy kind of questions. I'm really curious about your definition of family policy, because I went to the National Conservatism Conference down in Miami last September. And that was the first place I'd really heard people use this phrase in a very serious way and really have kind of a clear vision of what they wanted the state to really structure to incentivize certain habits within family formation. But I've heard that used in different ways. So how do you define family policy, and maybe if you could walk us through some of the various ideas that people tend to fit under that term?
Yeah, that's a great question. Uh, because family policy means very different things to different people. So for some people, family policy is, look, let's get the government out of the way of family formation. And so those people would tend to focus on changing the tax structure, which currently disincentivizes marriage, and other government regulations that they would say is, preventing family formation in the US. And then for other people, they would say, look, family policy should really be focused on increasing the fertility rate in the United States, that we have a huge problem. There's not going to be enough babies in the future. And so that's what we need to focus on. For me, I would say I don't really see family policy as either of those things. For me, family policy is more focused on supporting parents with kids or supporting people who want to have kids. So it's affirmative government action to support either parents of young children or people who are hoping to create families in the near future.
Well, I'm sure we'll get into some of the more specifics about that here in a moment, but that it makes sense to me. There's a sense in which the way that our governmental policies kind of structure society can either help parents or they can harm parents. I know I had a friend who has he and his wife have 5 kids, and in the middle of COVID, when there was a child tax credit payout of the sort, man, there was a period of months where I think they were getting $1,500 a month, and they were a family on one income with 5 kids, and they've been scrambling for so long, and all of a sudden their bank account was flush. And it was kind of
Yeah.
crazy. But that certainly that kind of financial incentive can be very helpful. Are there downsides to leaning on government to incentivize family formation in that way, or incentivize kind of I guess I want to say like pro children or pro natalist policies?
Well, I think we don't know because we haven't tried it at a mass scale yet. But in general, I'm very sympathetic to those who would say any mass government program does have downsides that we find hard to predict in the future. So, for example, if we started paying people, like $10,000 per child, for example, some people have suggested baby bonds that would sort of lead to that outcome. I think it's hard to know exactly what outcome we'd get from that. Um,
Well, let's get to your article. That of course is how we met over Twitter. I was really intrigued. This was published in the fall 22 edition of National Affairs. Your paper is entitled "Reframing Family Policy." Now you had some really interesting survey data I want to start with from that article. You argued that businesses particularly want to keep women in the workforce, but you had this different result that came out when women were surveyed. What did the survey data show about women in the workforce and parents in the workforce? What do folks really want to be able to do?
So that's a great question. So if you ask mothers of young children what they would prefer to do, more than half of them say that they would prefer to be home with their kids rather than being uh, at work full time. So the preferences of young mothers in this country are really they'd like to be home with while their kids are quite little. But as a country, we do almost nothing to support those preferences.
So what could we do? I mean, what help us imagine what that would look like if we had kind of businesses structuring for that kind of situation.
So I think there's things businesses could do, and then I think there's things that government could do.
Mhm.
So in terms of what businesses could do, it would be just to support their employees who live on one income, so who have mom or dad at work and the other spouse at home. I think the broadest area that's ripe for employer action is healthcare.
Mhm.
I did some surveys while writing that paper. And when I talked to people who live on one income, everybody talked about healthcare. And this is sort of a general American problem. But I think what's not realized is that there's a lot employers could do to fix it because employers decide how much their employees pay for healthcare. And the way that employers offer healthcare, this is a pretty technical point, but they subsidize healthcare for individual employees much more heavily than they subsidize healthcare for families. So if you are working for a business and you're getting healthcare through your business, which most people do, you're going to be a lot worse off than if you were just an individual getting healthcare
Mhm.
through your business. So the employer might subsidize, let's just say, 23% of individual costs for healthcare, but will only subsidize 15% of healthcare costs for a family. So there's a big gap there, and employers could do a lot to close it.
Okay, so that would really kind of that would shift some of those costs over to the company rather, or to the employer rather than to the employee in that case.
It would, yes. So it would be an action that an employer would have to take because it thinks that it's in the best interest of the company. But employers make moves like this all the time. I don't know if you've heard of ESG factors. Um, these are sort of environmental, social, and governance factors that business take into account when making business decisions. So sometimes, for example, business will say, we care a lot about the environment. So we're going to make decisions that are environmentally conscious because we think it's the right thing to do. I
Mm.
think employers should say, we care a lot about
Oh,
families.
okay.
And so we're going to make decisions that support families because we think it's the right thing to do. And I also think that there's a business case for it. I think that it would be a great way to attract great talent.
Mhm.
I think a lot of people who are supporting a stay-at-home spouse are dedicated, reliable, enthusiastic employees. I'm certainly not saying to working families aren't, but I think these are often really good employees, and I think businesses should think more carefully about what family benefits they offer to attract people who are supporting a family.
I think that's really interesting, and it certainly could be a huge benefit. I want to think. Let's think for a moment about those young moms and really kind of that choice to, in the one case, be in the workplace and continue advancing a career, uh, maybe either a low level kind of hourly wage career or a salaried career with kind of a clear trajectory. Um, and these moms, of course, are kind of facing a choice. Do they continue in their career? Do they step out for 2 or 3 years? Those youngest years, those most formative years. Um, did your research show that the work of mothers raising children their own, like raising their children rather than taking advantage of childcare opportunities in those earliest years, does that actually have an impact on a national level? Is there stuff we can directly look at to say, oh wow, this really does matter on a national level if we have moms not be raising their own kids, but instead putting them in daycare or in childcare situations?
So there's not a lot of studies that show having your kids in daycare is bad for kids. However, there are quite a few studies that show having your kids in low quality daycare is bad for kids. And for a lot of families, that's all they can afford.
Mm.
So, for example, the most prominent example of this is in Quebec, where Quebec decided that they really wanted to incentivize mothers to join the workforce. So they established a universal childcare program. And it was very cheap to enroll your child in this program. And the program was successful in what it set out to do. A lot of mothers did put their kids in this daycare, but it was not successful in terms of the kids. So it
Mm.
did seem like the kids who went through this program ended up worse off over the long term. According to a bunch of different factors, according to academic test scores, in the long term, in terms of their propensity to end up in jail, in terms of aggression. It seemed to be particularly bad for boys for reasons I think we don't really understand. I certainly would not say that merely putting your kids in daycare will hurt your kids, but putting kids in low quality daycare does seem to have a long-term detrimental impact on kids.
Are there the flip side kind of studies that are looking particularly at the I don't even know what the control group would look like, but a group of moms who like raise their kids versus a group of moms who are in the workplace, and like, is there a way to compare those two different groups of kids over time and kind of see the end results? Does that exist, or is that just kind of a popular myth?
I'm not aware of anything that's as targeted as you're saying. In general, having your kids in very high quality daycare seems to be okay. It doesn't seem like that has long-term negative impacts. I'd say the people who may suffer the most is just the mothers who
Hmm.
would rather be home with their kids and miss them and have to go to the workforce and miss out on those years of special memories. I don't know that that's been studied either, but we do have a lot of moms in this country who do want to be home with their kids and are at their jobs instead. Um, and you can't quantify that, but it's a real loss.
Oh, sure. Well, just maybe we have some listeners who are looking for a dissertation project and want to take on that qualitative and quantitative study. And if so, please do shoot us an email at optimisticcurmudgeon2021@gmail.com. Let us know that you took this on. Um, can we go a little bit deeper into why many families prefer to have one parent at home? Is this just a matter of kind of a sort of a basic internal desire? Are there specific outcomes that seem to flow from that, or is this just a relational part of being a parent that you want to raise your kids? Like what's behind that desire?
Yeah, I'm not aware of studies that really break down what is going on here, but through interviews that I've done, for a lot of people, it's basic, it's innate. Uh, these are my kids. I want to spend time with them while they're this little, and those are days that I'll never get back if I miss out on. I think we also see through the research that there are certain like demographics that especially prioritize having kids at home. Latino families in particular are unusually um, pessimistic on daycare. They really prefer to have kids either at home with mom or dad or with grandma or grandpa. For certain ethnic groups in the US, there's also a particularly high priority on having kids raised at home. And I can sort of speculate as to why that would be. Some ethnic groups have a really high priority on family relationships, and having kids at home helps strengthen those bonds. But that's just speculation. I don't have data on that.
Sure. Um, Well, I wonder if we could. You mentioned the price of high quality healthcare, or not healthcare. I'm sorry, high quality daycare, childcare options. That's certainly something I've heard plenty of teachers talk about. I mean, it's a pretty common phenomenon that we'll have teachers who, after the second, usually about the second child, there starts being like, is it worth it for me to be teaching? Because teaching, of course, is an infamously low salaried profession. But by the third child, it's like, oh wow, my paycheck is basically it's actually less than the cost of childcare for three kids. And so families will start to make that choice. Where does economic class come into this story? And how does, yeah, just let me just leave the question there. Where does economic class come into this story?
So excellent question. And the surveys are very clear that middle and lower class families strongly prefer to have their kids taken care of at home rather than in daycare. So I think part of that is the price of daycare. But I think part of it also is that they don't have quite the same relationship to their careers that upper class parents do. So if you look at the surveys, the only group that prefers to have two full-time working parents taking care of the kids as opposed to some other arrangement, a part-time working parent or one parent at home, that's upper class educated elites essentially. And that makes sense. They've invested a lot in their education, they've invested a lot in their careers, so they don't want to take time out of the workforce to take care of their kids. But that's not the case for any other socioeconomic class in the United States.
I'm wondering if that then contributes to also maintaining levels of wealth and status for that upper class family, because if they're kind of making that choice in the status quo. If the choice is a sales VP for a tech firm and a physician couple, if they're going to both work and then they're maintaining that income, that allows them to stay at a certain economic status. Whereas a middle income family might decide, no, we're going to have one parent step out of the workforce for 3 years and we're going to pinch and scrape and scrap and we're going to make this work. But then maybe 3 years later, that secondary income comes back. But there is an income loss there that could lead, depending on different circumstances, could be to the economic harm of that middle class family.
Certainly. And, I think the other thing we see is it's these upper class families that really want the two income families. And almost all of the policies we have in the United States are shaped towards their preferences.
Mm.
They want to be able to work full time, and they've been pushing employers to make that easier, to support employer funded childcare. They want government funded childcare. But they're kind of unique in those preferences, but they still have been very successful in convincing government and businesses to shape the world around what they prefer.
Well, let's go to those. You mentioned some business policies that or some employer end changes that could be made earlier. Let's go to some of those governmental changes that you outlined, and please do feel free to go into as much detail and as much technical description. Because I will confess, I had never heard of Social Security earning credits before I read your paper, and that may
That's
just be
probably a blessing, Josh.
it probably is. I'm also in my 30s. I have a few decades where I need to know the ins and outs of how Social Security works, if it's still there in 25, 30 years. But walk us through. You outlined at least three areas where we could have policy reforms on a government side that could create different incentive structures: Social Security earning credits, 401k policies, and family insurance. Walk us through your thoughts on those and what's possible there.
Sure. So I'll start with the 401ks because those are kind of the most straightforward. So I'm sure you and your listeners, your viewers know what 401ks are. Everybody who works at a job has probably access to a 401k or a 403b plan. And so this is a major way that people save for retirement. But if you're married, you can only save in an individual 401k account. So Josh, if you've got a 401k, it's in your name. It's not in yours and your wife's name. And these individual retirement plans make it really difficult for families that have stay-at-home parents. I'll just take the example of my husband. He's got a 403b plan. Unless I ask him, I don't know what he's invested in. I don't know how much money is in there. The amount that he can contribute to his 403b is less than how much we could contribute if I was working also. So the maximum deferrals are less than the two of us could have deferred together if I was working as well. And, God forbid he dies and I'm left a widow, and I'm not familiar with his investment choices, it's going to be hard for me to take over that plan and really understand what's going on there because I don't, have access to it on a regular basis. So what I've proposed is creating a family 401k plan. So under this plan, my husband and I would own title to his retirement savings plan together. And the amount that a family could defer into this plan would be the same as if there were two, as if I worked also. So the idea would just really be to equalize what's available to two working families and make it open to families that have a stay-at-home parent, and also make it a lot easier for the stay-at-home parent to understand what's going on with the money. Um, this might be controversial, but in my opinion, a family with a stay-at-home parent and a working parent, the stay-at-home parent makes possible the working
Mhm.
parent's earnings. And I think we should recognize that as a society and that they should both have title to that money.
Oh, I think that makes a ton of sense. I mean, I think there seems like there's something there about the if we're on a stereotypical model and the wife is home, the husband is working. We've made several moves over the last century to say that women should be able to own property, they should be able to do all these things. That same, I mean, like that makes perfect sense to me that she also needs to have access to investments. And I mean, I think I'm thinking through my school's 401k plan. My wife and I both teach, and we both have separate retirement accounts, but we're hoping next year that she's not teaching. And that is a retirement savings loss that in the system you're describing, I could hypothetically, I could double my, I could double mine and or increase mine beyond the current cap. And yeah, that would be really interesting.
Yeah, and also this is another area where then employers would be able to step up and support families with a stay-at-home parent. I don't know if you get some sort of employer match or
Mhm.
employer contribution, but it would also make it possible for employers to match recognizing that there's a spouse at home. So make a greater match because you're deferring more money into the plan.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. How about either Social Security earning credits or family insurance?
Okay, let's start next with Social Security credits. This is pretty technical, but is good information for anybody to know.
Mhm.
Social Security retirement benefits are paid out when you reach your Social Security retirement age. Right now, for people retiring around now, it's around 66 and a half, but it's probably going to be later when you and I are retiring, Josh, unfortunately. Um, and the way the payout is determined is Social Security looks at your earnings over your entire life. It assigns a certain amount of credits for each year you've worked. Um, there is a maximum amount of years that they look at. I think it's 35, although I'm not remembering exactly right now. But the long and short of this is that women who step out of the workforce to raise kids are penalized under the current Social Security system. So they'll earn less credits because they haven't been working. And when they come to the end of their working life and go to retirement, they will collect less from Social Security because of the time they've taken out of the workforce. So what I have proposed is that the government give child care credits for the Social Security retirement calculation. Um, so um, I'd like to see the government offer 3 years of credit for um, each child that a woman takes time out of the workforce to care for. And I think this would be the government really recognizing that raising children is good for a family, but it's also good for the rest of society. It's kind of trite to say, but without kids, we don't have a country. And I'd like the government to really step up there and recognize that fact. And this would help ensure that women or men who stay home to take care of their little kids don't come to retirement and not have enough money to retire comfortably on.
Okay, that too makes sense. What is this idea of family insurance? Is that the same thing as the healthcare plan we were talking about earlier, or is this something different?
No, this is disability insurance.
Ah,
So there's two kinds of ways you can get disability insurance in the United States. One is through the government, and the other is through your employer. So if you're a stay-at-home spouse, you have no employer, so you don't have any employer-sponsored disability insurance. Uh, But it doesn't have to be that way. Your spouse's employer could offer a type of insurance that would support the family in the event you become disabled. And so you might say to me, Josh, well, you're not working. Why does the family need insurance coverage for this? But if mom is a stay-at-home mom and she suddenly becomes disabled, the family's going to have all sorts of costs. They might have housekeeping costs, they might have childcare costs. There's going to be a lot actually that they're going to need to cover if a stay-at-home mom or dad becomes disabled. So I proposed that employers work with insurance companies to create a new product that would help insure families with a stay-at-home spouse in the event that that stay-at-home spouse becomes disabled. So that's one bucket. The other bucket is government disability insurance. It's called SSDI, Social Security Disability Insurance. And like Social Security retirement benefits, it's keyed to your working years. And if you're not in the workforce, you don't get it. And if you've been out of the workforce too long, you also don't get it. So what I would propose is basically a fix to cover moms or dads who's taken time out of the workforce to ensure that they're still covered by SSDI in the event that they become disabled while they're out of the workforce taking care of little kids.
all three of those sound very practical. I mean, they're you've obviously thought through the details of each of those, but they seem relatively straightforward to implement. What is this a concern of either major political party in the United States today?
It is not. It is, well, that's not entirely true. There is a little bit of movement around Social Security retirement credits, and that is mostly on the Democratic Party side, but there's not a ton. And I think it is a real shame that neither political party, but especially the Republican Party, is not stepping up to support families that want to have a stay-at-home parent. Although I think this should be a bipartisan issue.
There are so many. This is up there with so many other things that seem very straightforwardly bipartisan to me that we ought to be able to just recognize it is common sense that the work of raising children and making a home is of huge, enormous societal benefit, and it is something that we ought to recognize as such, and that should not raise partisan rancor. But obviously, that would require a different political life than we currently have. I wonder if we could shift gears just a little bit because I was when I was reading your paper, it took me back to a fascinating conversation I had at the National Conservatism Conference, where I met a guy from Hungary, and he was telling me all about the family policy structures they put in place in Hungary. And he was describing, it just kind of blew my mind. I could not imagine a government that would actually do this. He described, I forget if it was after the second child or the third child, but after a certain number of children, women no longer pay income tax. Where if you get married, and I think when you get married, you get there's like a $50,000 loan to help a couple buy a house. And if you have children within a certain window, that loan is completely forgiven. It's already super low interest. He even described something like a government subsidy for one of those like giant homeschool vans.
Mm.
Or just like if you need to buy I forget, I have a friend who a couple years ago who had to, I think they were up to 6 or 7 kids in a town in Michigan, and he bought this like it's like a small RV, but it's a single person van. um and he was describing all of this, and I was just really curious about your thoughts on the long-term effectiveness of those kinds of policies. Or could those, and obviously those are all geared towards reversing Hungary's negative fertility rate, but then so what is, and this please feel free to go beyond what your data suggests here. I mean, this is, I'm asking for opinion and speculation, but what are your thoughts on the long-term effectiveness of those kinds of policies? And could such things be effective in the United States context?
So first off, I'm just going to mention that I homeschool, and I always know when I've arrived at the right spot for a homeschool event based on the size of the vans in the parking lot. If they're
Yeah.
very big, I know we're at the right spot. But more seriously, looking at Hungary, I think, the Hungary's policies are very interesting. It doesn't seem like they have shown to have long-term effectiveness. So they do seem to have sort of temporarily boosted Hungary's fertility rate, but very much TBA on what effect they will have over the long term in Hungary. I also think that they're very unlikely to be implemented in the United States. I just do not see the US government at any point, paying out large amounts of money for women who have 5 kids, for example. I just think that is not in the cards. Maybe I'm too cynical, but I think that is very unlikely. Um, However, the thing I love about Hungary's policies, and I would love to see adopted in the United States, is this recognition that family is important, that children are important, that society cannot survive without family and children, and that a major focus of government has to be on how we support families. So in the United States, this is going to be done in an American specific way. It is not going to be done in the Hungarian way. And that's just how it is. And I think that's actually probably for the best. Every country is different and has a different culture and a different way of approaching problems. But I think Hungary is absolutely right in the focus that it brings to the family and the focus that it brings on making sure that parents are able to have kids and raise them the way they want.
Love that. I think you're absolutely right about the American specific way that might be applied here. Now, I do want to break in because we have a first on the Optimistic Curmudgeon where a live stream listener on LinkedIn has sent in a question. So
Oh,
here's
great.
an unexpected question. What is the funding source for the additional coverages? Would this require cutting other programs, raising taxes? I think that's referring specifically to the kind of that might be referring to the disability coverages or some of the other pieces you were speaking about earlier.
Yeah, so for a lot of what I've been talking about, there's not going to be tons of extra cost. Well, the employer would have to voluntarily agree to pick up the cost. So there would be extra costs, but not to the government. It would be an employer decision to sort of pick up the tab here. And um, as I've said before, I think there's a real business case for why employers should seriously consider that. In terms of disability insurance through Social Security, there would be some cost to that, but there's not that many women or men in their reproductive years who become disabled. So the cost there would be pretty minimal. We'd really just be fixing a hole that impacts a really tiny percentage of Americans, but really, really impacts them when it does. I have talked with a family where the mom did become disabled, and it was just devastating for them. And they could not get government support. They had no employer support, and it was really difficult for them. So that would be sort of low government cost, but really high reward for those very limited numbers of families who need it. On the Social Security retirement benefits, that would be expensive. There's no question about it. And we need to reform Social Security anyway. We're headed for real problems there. But on the other hand, I would think of it this way. Social Security is built to only survive if there are young people paying into the system. And part of the problem that we're having with Social Security is there's not as many young people available to support the boomer generation in the country. And the problem is just going to get worse with America's declining fertility rate. So if you take the really broad view of Social Security, making it possible for people to have children actually ensures the longevity of the Social Security system, because it is only designed to work if people have children who then grow up and enter the workforce. If that does not happen, Social Security collapses within one generation. So I would encourage policymakers to step back a little bit and think about how Social Security is structured when they think about whether or not to support families with little kids.
Well, thank you for taking our listeners or our viewers' question there, Ivana. Um, one other kind of random curveball question as we wrap up towards the end. You mentioned the Republican Party ought to kind of embrace this in a way. I'm personally very much hoping that Ron DeSantis makes a 2024 presidential run. I'd be very excited to if he did so. So I just want to toss you a hypothetical. If you happen to have dinner with presidential candidate DeSantis as he's putting his family policy platform together, what three policy changes would you urge him to make as the in this area as the head of the executive branch?
Well, the first thing I would encourage him to do is just to talk about the subject, for goodness sakes. We get radio silence so often from politicians on this. And I think if he were able to speak to the need to support families and support families with little kids, and particularly families with stay-at-home parents, that would be great. There's been some chatter in the Republican Party about being the party of parents. But if you look at surveys of the Republican base, many of them want to have mom or dad at home and the other parent in the workforce. And if he could say, look, that's a thing that government ought to support, that would be amazing. To get some like real concentrated affirmation from a politician that government should be supporting families with a stay-at-home parent. So that is number one. Um, the second thing that I would really like him to do is think about how healthcare can be reformed to support families with one parents, because that really is, like I said, if you talk to families with a stay-at-home spouse, that is like, it's healthcare, 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 healthcare. And so this isn't a policy proposal that I have discussed, but I do think that that is the major area where a national politician would want to concentrate his energy. And then the third would be making it easier for families with a stay-at-home parent to retire. And so I think the two policy proposals that I've discussed, based on both Social Security retirement credits and creating a family 401k, would be really fruitful grounds there. And these are not sort of like huge, complex policy changes. They don't require, establishing some new massive government bureaucracy. They're small, but they could make a big difference.
Which is the kind of change, at least I think we could make and could be good. I'm not in favor of brand new bureaucratic endeavors. I think we have plenty of examples of attempts to start new bureaucratic endeavors that just multiply problems. But I do think it's possible to have small changes that take our existing structures and make them a little bit better for the average American citizen. Um, so and I want to go back to where we started. We talked at the beginning of our conversation about you kind of reached during COVID. It was pretty evident that you saw this as an either or choice, and you chose to be home with your family for this season. We're now on the other side of COVID, Lord willing. Hopefully, it's never coming back, and we're never shutting things down and going back to school. But 2 years later, when you look at that, feel free to answer this however you like, but do you think you made the right choice? And are you happier where you are, or do you think you want to eventually make a move back into the workforce?
I absolutely made the right choice. It has been the most tremendous blessing to be home with my kids. We had a third child recently, and I was talking to my husband and I said, I just am so grateful I don't have to send her to daycare. I remember when I dropped both of my older sons off at daycare, it just felt like the world was ending. And I know not everybody has that reaction to daycare. And, it's always so hard to talk about work-life balance because you never want to criticize people who've made different choices. So this
Sure.
is in no way to say that, there's anything wrong with putting your kids in daycare, but I just felt like my whole world came crashing down when I had to leave my kids at daycare. And it has been such a blessing to have the ability to be home with them while they're little, and to know that with my daughter, I'll be home with her too through those early years and get to see her first steps and hear her first words and just be there for it. You can't put a price on that.
Ah, very true. Well, Ivana, thank you so much for the conversation tonight. Where can people find and follow your work online?
So I am on Twitter. I am at Ivana D. Greco on Twitter. I have a Substack called The Home Front. And those would be the major two places.
All right. Well, we will be sure to link to the homefront.substack.com, and hopefully, maybe a couple of our listeners are intrigued and want to follow your work, and we'll do that there. Well, Ivana, thank you so much for joining me tonight for this conversation, and thank you, listeners, for tuning in for another episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon. My guest this episode has been Ivana Greco, a former lawyer, now researcher and writer on family policy alongside her homemaking career. If you like this episode, please do leave us a 5-star review and share it with your friends. Until next time, seek the good, discover the true, and love the beautiful. You've been listening to another episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. I'm your host, Josh Herring. The Optimistic Curmudgeon is a project of Thales Press. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star review and share it with your friends. You can find us on 3 major social media platforms. Search for The Optimistic Curmudgeon on Facebook and LinkedIn, and find us on Twitter at the handle @TheOptimisticC3. This episode was edited and produced by Madison Kay, audio engineer for The Optimistic Curmudgeon. Until next time, seek the good, pursue the true, and love the beautiful.